August 22nd, 1965, South Bend, Indiana. A 49-year-old Edward Banish is murdered inside his home after being stabbed 7 times. Over 2 months earlier, Edward's 18-year-old son, Scott Banish, had gone missing after an apparent drowning accident. But 8 days after his father's murder, Scott is discovered to be alive and admits to having faked his own death. Even though Scott seems to have a solid alibi, he eventually admits to killing Edward and is arrested and charged with the crime. However, after Scott recants his confession, a grand jury rules that there is insufficient evidence to indict him, so the charges are dropped. And there are no conclusive answers about who actually killed Edward. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I am your host Robin Warder, and today's case is going to be one of the most unusual mysteries we've ever covered, the 1965 murder of Edward Banish. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Holly Dodson, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Holly. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for 7 years now, so if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, what's particularly bizarre about today's story is that it started off as one mystery before it unexpectedly evolved into another. At first, the central victim was an 18-year-old high school student named Scott Banish, who supposedly vanished after making a trip from South Bend, Indiana in order to go swimming at Warren Dunes State Park in Michigan. The initial theory was that Scott drowned in Lake Michigan, but the case took an unexpected turn 2.5 months later when Scott's father, Edward Banish, was murdered inside his residence after being stabbed 7 times by an intruder. And things got really crazy a short time later when Scott was discovered to be alive, as he admitted that he had faked his own death and spent the past few months traveling across the country. While Scott initially maintained that he was around 2,500 miles away at the time his father was killed, he eventually got charged with the crime after making a confession, but soon recanted it, claiming that he only admitted to the murder after undergoing a pressure-filled interrogation from the police. When a grand jury heard the case, they felt that the evidence against Scott wasn't strong enough to indict him or bring him to trial, so the charges were dropped and the story pretty much faded from the spotlight. So yeah, this whole saga has enough twists and turns for 3 cases, and it only begs the question, if Scott Banish did not actually kill his father, then who did, and what could their motive have been? Well, we're going to try and look at all the different angles on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on a regular feed. In addition, I wanted to announce that at the end of next month, The Trail Went Cold will be releasing another Q&A episode, so if you have a question you would like to hear me answer on the show, please send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Q&A, to robin.warder@icloud.com. The deadline to send in questions will just be over 2 weeks from now on Friday, December the 13th. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of Edward Banish. Our story begins in South Bend, Indiana in 1965. Our central figure is 49-year-old Edward Banish, who is a staff sergeant with the United States Army and a regular non-commissioned officer assigned as an assistant advisor to the 60th Artillery Unit at the South Bend Armed Forces Reserve Center. Born in Manitoba, Canada, Edward spent much of his childhood living in the suburbs of Chicago before he joined the military, and at this point, he is a 19-year veteran who has served in World War II and the Korean War. Edward currently lives at a middle-class residence in Clay Township with his 46-year-old wife Loretta Banish, whom he has been married to for over 23 years, and the couple have 2 children, 18-year-old Scott and 13-year-old Kathy. 2 years earlier, the family moved to South Bend after Edward completed a 4-year tour of Germany. In fact, he is scheduled to be transferred to Thailand in just over 1 month, but plans to retire from the military after he completes his 20 years of service next year. Scott Banish is only 1 week away from graduating from Clay High School, and instead of accompanying his father to Thailand, he is planning to attend Indiana University South Bend in the fall. At around 8 a.m. on June the 3rd, Scott borrowed his father's car and left his residence to drive to Warren Dunes State Park, located just across the state line in Berrien County, Michigan, about 35 miles northwest of South Bend. Scott was planning to meet up with some friends and go swimming in Lake Michigan near the Tower Hill Dune, and told his parents that he would be back by 4 p.m. However, Scott did not return as planned, and when he failed to resurface by 6 p.m., Edward and Loretta went to check the homes of some of his friends to see if he might be there. But to the Banish's surprise, all of Scott's friends informed them that Scott had canceled their outing because he felt it was too cold to go swimming that day. This compelled the Banishes to hop into Loretta's car and drive out to Warren Dunes State Park to search for Scott, but when they arrived, they found Edward's car in the parking lot near Tower Hill. The vehicle was unlocked, and Scott's wallet and some clothing were still inside, but since there was no sign of him anywhere, the Banishes contacted the police in order to report Scott missing. Police performed a search of the Tower Hill beach and wound up coming across a blanket, towel, and some suntan lotion at a spot that was about 100 feet from Lake Michigan. The Banishes identified these items as belonging to Scott, so an extensive search effort was launched for him. Over the course of the next several days, the park was thoroughly checked, and divers looked through Lake Michigan, but no trace of Scott could be found, and investigators were unable to uncover any witnesses who could recall having seen him on the day of his disappearance. Edward's transfer to Thailand was scheduled to take place on July the 7th, but the Army agreed to suspend these orders so Edward can continue looking for his missing son. The search effort eventually came to an end, but even though divers failed to find Scott's body, law enforcement was inclined to believe that he had gone swimming in the lake and become the victim of an accidental drowning, so they essentially closed the investigation. However, the Banishes were not entirely convinced that Scott had drowned, as some of his personal items, including his t-shirt, sports cap, sunglasses, and wristwatch, were never recovered, and his parents did not believe he would have gone swimming while wearing these items. In spite of this traumatic ordeal, the Banishes did their best to continue on living their normal lives, and on the evening of August the 22nd, 2.5 months after Scott disappeared, they were paid a visit at their home by Loretta's uncle and aunt, George and Albina Tangle. The Tangles would spend the night playing cards with Edward, Loretta, and their daughter Kathy in a recreation room downstairs in the basement, but shortly before midnight, Edward told everyone that he was tired and going to bed. Edward then headed upstairs while the others continued playing cards, but a short time later, they heard a loud noise inside the house. Loretta went upstairs to see what was going on, but when she arrived in the living room, she was shocked to see Edward standing by the front door, covered in blood. Before Edward had a chance to say anything, he collapsed to the floor, and his family immediately called for help. Even though Edward was soon rushed to a nearby hospital, he was pronounced dead on arrival. Edward's family had initially believed that he had suffered some sort of medical emergency, but it turned out he had received a total of 7 deep stab wounds to his neck, chest, and arms, and his throat was also slashed. When the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene, they discovered Edward's wallet and a lit flashlight on the floor. The wallet contained $6, and the flashlight likely belonged to the killer. It turned out that someone had gone to the trouble of removing the screen on a small window on the first floor and propped it up against a nearby tree before they pushed the window open and entered the residence. Footprints were also found in some dirt outside a basement window, which seemed to indicate that the killer had peeked inside at some point and saw the family playing cards downstairs. Edward's bedroom was located on the first floor, and he normally kept his wallet on a dresser next to the bed. So it was theorized that after Edward went upstairs to turn in, this unknown intruder may have woken him up while stealing the wallet. When the intruder tried to flee, Edward probably chased after him into the living room until the intruder fought back and stabbed him 7 times. The perpetrator likely dropped Edward's wallet and their flashlight when they escaped through the open window, as blood smears were found on the draperies. Since the flashlight was battered, Edward was probably struck with it during the struggle, but unfortunately, it did not yield any fingerprints. A homicide investigation was launched, and St. Joseph County Sheriff William Laux told the press that since nothing appeared to have been stolen from the residence, he did not believe that burglary was the primary motive for the crime. Even though there was no evidence to indicate that Edward's murder and Scott's disappearance were connected, the sheriff's department did openly acknowledge the possibility that both victims could have been killed by the same person. Well, on August the 30th, 8 days after Edward's murder, the case went in a truly unexpected direction when Sheriff Laux was contacted by the Allen County Sheriff's Department in Fort Wayne, 90 miles away. At around 1:20 p.m. that afternoon, a young man had shown up at an Army recruitment station at the Fort Wayne Federal Building in order to enlist. The recruiter called Selective Service System officials in St. Joseph's County to check the young man's draft status, but learned that several months earlier he already tried to enlist, but received a 4F classification, which meant he was unfit for military service since he had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a cancer-like illness which affects the lymph nodes. But even more surprisingly, the young man's name was Scott Banish, and he had disappeared and supposedly drowned nearly 3 months earlier. The recruiter was advised to notify the Allen County Sheriff's Department about this, and by the time they arrived at the federal building, the young man calling himself Scott Banish was still there. He was then taken into custody and detained in the Allen County Jail, and when Sheriff Laux was informed about what was going on, he traveled to Fort Wayne alongside one of his deputies. When they arrived and questioned the young man, he was carrying a Social Security card and a Selective Service System draft card, which both had the name Daniel McFarland on it. Nonetheless, he confirmed that his real name was Scott Banish, and he was also the same Scott Banish who had gone missing months earlier. When Sheriff Laux asked Scott about the recent murder of his father, Scott was left completely surprised by the news, as he claimed he had not heard about it. Laux then informed Scott that he would be investigated as a potential suspect and had the right to an attorney, but Scott said he did not need one. Sheriff Laux and his deputy then started driving Scott back to St. Joseph County, but during their trip, Laux told him that 3 different eyewitnesses had recently reported seeing him in South Bend. Scott responded by saying that the witnesses were mistaken, as he claimed he had only arrived in Fort Wayne the previous day and had not returned to South Bend at all since he disappeared in June. After arriving in South Bend, Scott was detained for questioning at the St. Joseph County Jail, where he was visited by his mother and they had an emotional reunion. When questioned by Sheriff Laux, Scott finally shared the full story about his disappearance and admitted that he had traveled to Warren Dunes State Park in order to stage his drowning for the purposes of faking his own death. I just mentioned that prior to his disappearance, Scott had wanted to enlist in the military, but when he applied for appointment to a service academy, he received a 4F classification. Scott had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, but even though he received treatment after undergoing an operation at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland and only required biannual checkups, he was still deemed to be unfit for military service. Since Scott's father and all the other male members of his family had served, he was quite devastated about being unable to follow in their footsteps, so he dreamed up the idea of faking his death in order to start a new life, as he hoped he would be able to enlist in the military under his new identity. 1 month before he vanished, Scott withdrew $200 from his bank account, which he used to finance his plan. After driving his father's car to Warren Dunes State Park and leaving many of his personal items inside the vehicle and on the beach, Scott claimed that he hitchhiked to Michigan City, Indiana, before hopping on a train to Chicago, and when he arrived there, he boarded an airplane flight to San Francisco. He subsequently boarded another flight to Los Angeles, and soon acquired a Social Security card under the fake name Daniel McFarland. But when Scott attempted to use this name to enlist in the Coast Guard at a recruiting station in Long Beach, he was informed he could not do so unless he provided a birth certificate. Since his plan did not work, Scott would spend the next 2 months hitchhiking to various locations throughout the United States, such as Colorado Springs, Salt Lake City, and New Orleans, where he worked odd jobs under his new name. While in New Orleans, Scott managed to register for the draft under his false identity, which is why he was carrying a draft card with the name Daniel McFarland on it. But even though he attempted to enlist in both the Army and the Navy, he was once again told he could not do so without a birth certificate. In August, Scott/Daniel traveled to the unincorporated community of Charleston, Oregon, and got a job on a tuna fishing boat called the Joanne, which was captained by a skipper named Paul Vines. Scott claimed that on August the 18th, the Joanne went out onto the Pacific Ocean, and he spent the next 5 days fishing alongside Captain Vines until they returned to shore and docked in the town of Newport on August the 23rd. If Scott was telling the truth, then this gave him a pretty rock-solid alibi, placing him around 2,500 miles away when his father was murdered on the evening of the 22nd. Shortly after he docked, Scott said that he received his paycheck from Captain Vines, and after cashing it, he spent the night in Newport. Scott then spent the next few nights hitchhiking and staying in various cities like Boise, Idaho, New Buffalo, Michigan, and Michigan City, Indiana, before he boarded a bus to Fort Wayne and arrived there on August the 29th. After spending the night in a rented room at the YMCA, Scott then went to the Federal Building the following afternoon and made another attempt to enlist in the Army. This time, he used his real name rather than his pseudonym, Daniel McFarland, as Scott said he was holding out hope that his draft status might have been reclassified since he disappeared. Scott was able to provide evidence to support his story, including a pay stub for the $192 check he said he received from his fishing job, and it was signed by the boat's captain, Paul Vines. When Sheriff Locke phoned Captain Vines in Oregon, the captain was able to confirm that he had hired a young man named Daniel McFarland for a job on his tuna vessel, the Joanne, and the two of them were out fishing in the Pacific Ocean about 100 miles off the Oregon coast between August the 18th and the 23rd. Vines also confirmed that shortly after they arrived, the young man had asked for a paycheck because he was leaving to go back home. The description that Vines provided for Daniel McFarland seemed to perfectly match Scott's description, and when new photographs of Scott were taken and mailed to Vines, he was able to confirm that Scott Banish and Daniel McFarland were the same person. When investigators checked the motels that Scott claimed he had stayed at in Newport and Boise, they found signatures in the guest registers for Daniel McFarland, which seemed to match Scott's signature. Since his account appeared to hold up, Scott was finally released from custody and returned home to his mother and younger sister, and Sheriff Locke told the press that Scott had been cleared of involvement in his father's murder. However, it soon became apparent that Locke still had his nagging suspicions about Scott, and would later say that his announcement about Scott being cleared as a suspect was nothing more than a ruse, so he could secretly continue his investigation. When Scott was first taken into custody, Locke noticed that he appeared to have traces of blood on his pants, but Scott claimed that it was blood from some fish he had cleaned while on board the Joanne. On September the 7th, while the Banish family were away in Illinois, the sheriff's department entered the residence and took Scott's pants as evidence without the family's knowledge. The pants were sent to the Indiana State Police Laboratory for testing, and they concluded that the blood was likely human and contained properties of type AB blood, which just happened to be Edward's blood type. On October the 21st, Sheriff Locke decided to bring Scott in for questioning again. During their previous round of questioning, Scott agreed to take a lie detector test, and while the results were inconclusive, they did apparently show signs of deception in some of Scott's answers to questions about his father's murder. Scott agreed to take a polygraph for a second time, but wound up failing. He would be interrogated for nearly 12 hours and was confronted about the results of the polygraph, as well as the testing that was performed on the blood from his pants. In the end, Scott finally agreed to sign a statement in which he confessed to killing his father, and he was subsequently arrested on a preliminary charge of second-degree murder. Sheriff Locke told the press that after numerous failed attempts to enlist in the military, Scott had returned to his family's home in South Bend in order to retrieve his birth certificate, which was kept inside a safety deposit box. But shortly after Scott entered the residence, Edward walked in on him attempting to break into the deposit box, which caused Scott to panic and accidentally stab his father. Scott then fled the house and hid the knife in a wooded area across the street, and after returning to South Bend and being released from custody a few months later, Scott retrieved the knife from the woods and cleaned it before putting it inside a footlocker in his bedroom. However, shortly after his arrest, Scott recanted his confession, claiming that Sheriff Locks had pressured and threatened him during their interrogation session. He said that Locks offered him a deal in which he could confess to the crime and only be charged with involuntary manslaughter. Due to his young age, Scott was assured that he would only get a sentence of probation and a brief stay in a mental institution, but if he did confess, he would likely be found guilty of murder at trial and receive a sentence of life imprisonment or possibly even the death penalty. Scott maintained that he only told Locks what he wanted to hear and signed the confession to bring an end to his interrogation. Scott would be remanded to the St. Joseph County Jail until a preliminary hearing was held in St. Joseph Circuit Court the following week. You might be wondering how the authorities were able to get past Scott's seemingly ironclad alibi, which placed him around 2,500 miles away in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Oregon on the night of his father's murder. He believed that there was actually an entirely different young man out there named Daniel McFarland who bore a striking resemblance to Scott and was hired by Captain Paul Vines to accompany him on his fishing trip on the Joanne between August the 18th and the 23rd. After Scott committed the murder in South Bend, he took a flight to Oregon and wound up crossing paths with the real Daniel McFarland sometime after he returned to shore. Scott then managed to obtain Daniel's social security card, his draft card, and the pay stub he had received from Captain Vines, which explained why Scott had these items in his possession when he was taken into custody. However, the issue is that when Captain Vines was subpoenaed to testify at the hearing, he still maintained that he was absolutely certain that Scott Banish and Daniel McFarland were the same person, and rejected the idea that a completely different young man had spent 5 days fishing with him on board the Joanne. The captain's testimony was supported by his wife, Helen Vines, who had also interacted with Daniel McFarland and was certain he was Scott. She even testified that she witnessed the Joanne dock in Newport on August the 23rd, the day after Edward was killed, and Scott was definitely on board at that time. If that wasn't enough, during its voyage through the Pacific, the Joanne was frequently accompanied and shadowed by another fishing boat called the Holmes. The boat's captain and a deckhand were also subpoenaed to testify, and they both confirmed that they saw Scott on board the Joanne the entire time it was out at sea. Another hole in Sheriff Locks' theory is that no one under the name Scott Banish or Daniel McFarland could be found on any records for flights from the Midwest to Oregon on August the 22nd or the 23rd. When Loretta Banish took the stand to testify at the hearing, she claimed that Scott's birth certificate was kept inside a safety deposit box at their bank rather than their house, though she did acknowledge that she wasn't sure if Scott knew this. Well, on November the 2nd, after the preliminary hearing reached its conclusion, the judge ruled that there was no probable cause to hold Scott for murder and ordered him to be discharged and released from custody. In spite of this, the prosecuting attorney's office still intended to present their case to a St. Joseph Circuit Court grand jury, and the proceedings took place over 2 weeks later behind closed doors. But on November the 18th, the grand jury announced that they would not be handing down a murder indictment against Scott, as they felt there was insufficient evidence to bring him to trial. Scott remained a free man, and the Banish family soon moved away to Illinois. In October of 1967, Scott made an attempt to file a $2 million lawsuit in federal court against Sheriff Locks and 6 of his deputies, alleging that he had been the victim of false arrest, false imprisonment, and malicious prosecution. But 8 months later, in June of 1968, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit dismissed the lawsuit because even though Scott was never indicted, they felt that Scott's confession, his failing of the polygraph test, and the blood found on his jeans were enough probable cause for the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department to have arrested him. Scott eventually got married and settled in DeKalb, Illinois, where he spent over 20 years working as an electrical foreman at Northern Illinois University, until he passed away on December the 23rd, 2015, at the age of 68. As far as I can tell, very little additional investigation was performed into the murder after Scott was released from custody, and the case pretty much faded from the spotlight, so after nearly 60 years, there are still no conclusive answers about who was actually responsible for killing Edward Banish. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So after covering so many cold cases on The Trail Went Cold, I didn't think I would encounter too many more scenarios in the true crime sphere that are unprecedented, but this is probably the first case I've seen in which someone went missing, their father was murdered months later, and the missing victim was then miraculously found alive and accused of said murder. If Scott Banish was responsible for killing his father Edward, then this sounds like one of those elaborate, larger-than-life murder plots you would expect to find in a work of fiction, but in real life, it's hard to imagine an 18-year-old being this sophisticated and pulling it off. On one hand, it does seem like an incredibly suspicious coincidence that Scott just happened to resurface and was found alive only 8 days after his father was killed, so I certainly don't blame law enforcement for looking at him as a potential suspect. On the other hand, Scott seems to have one of the strongest alibis I've ever seen for someone who was charged with murder, and if he was guilty, he would have either had to convince a bunch of people to lie for him, or he just happened to be incredibly lucky. But of course, if Scott did not actually kill Edward, then who did? It does not sound like anyone has ever popped up on the radar as a compelling alternate suspect, and I've never heard anything about Edward's background to suggest he had any serious enemies who had a motive to murder him. Yes, on the surface, it appears that Edward simply may have been the victim of a burglary gone wrong, but even that scenario doesn't make 100% sense either. I originally learned about this case after reading a post about it on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit a few years ago, and when I began performing research, the only article I could find which was published after the 1960s was a piece about it published in the South Bend Tribune in 2017. This seems to indicate that after the grand jury declined to indict Scott, the investigation into Edward's murder came to an abrupt halt, as it's possible that law enforcement still had serious tunnel vision and believed that if they couldn't pin the crime on Scott, there wasn't much else they could do to solve it. Well, before Edward was murdered, Scott's disappearance was a pretty compelling mystery in its own right, because even though the authorities initially believed that he died in a tragic drowning accident, his family were not convinced and believed there was likely more to the story. In many cases like this, I usually believe that the victim's family were grasping at straws and ignoring the obvious solution in order to deal with the grief, but this was one case where their instincts actually turned out to be correct. The Banishes found it odd that some of Scott's personal items, including his wristwatch and hat, were not on the beach or inside Edward's car, as they did not believe he would have worn them if he went swimming. There's also the fact that Scott was supposed to travel to Warren Dunes State Park with some friends, but decided to cancel the trip because he believed Lake Michigan would be too cold that day. So therefore, it didn't make much sense for Scott to then travel up there alone and go swimming. It turned out that Scott had actually been brainstorming a plan to fake his own death for a while, and originally planned to stage a boating accident on Lake Michigan with one of his friends to make it look like they both drowned until the friend backed out. It was later revealed that this friend knew Scott was alive the entire time he was missing and kept his mouth shut, and I'm sure he must have felt incredibly awkward when Scott wound up being charged with his father's murder. Now, I'll state right up front that I do not believe Scott was guilty of the crime, but I also think his plan to fake his own death was incredibly stupid. As you recall, his motive for doing so was because he got rejected for military service due to his battles with Hodgkin's disease, but he figured that if he was able to start a new life under a new identity, he might be able to enlist under his new name. But of course, the problem was that he couldn't do so without a birth certificate, which he did not have in his possession. It might seem weird that after traveling all over the country and making numerous failed attempts to enlist under his new name, Daniel McFarland, Scott ultimately decided to return to Fort Wayne, Indiana to try enlisting under his real name, which is how he was discovered to be alive. However, Scott pretty much admitted that this was a last-ditch effort kind of thing. He had spent over 2 months traveling through the U.S. working odd jobs and not making much money, which was pretty draining for him, so I think he figured that if this enlistment in Fort Wayne led to his ruse being uncovered, he would just return home and go back to his old life. Scott even said that when he presented his information at the Fort Wayne Federal Building, he instantly sensed something was wrong and that the jig was up when he saw the recruiter get on the phone with Selective Service System officials in St. Joseph County to check his draft status. But of course, this only begs the question, if Scott was guilty of his father's murder, why would he return to Indiana and make it so easy for the authorities to catch him? Another unique aspect of this case is that the lead investigator, St. Joseph County Sheriff William Lux, publicly cleared Scott as a suspect after questioning him, but then just over 1 month later, he completely changed his mind and took Scott back into custody for further interrogation before he was arrested on the preliminary charge of second-degree murder. Laux would later say that clearing Scott as a suspect was nothing more than a ruse in order to catch him off guard, so he could secretly perform a more thorough investigation. But the alibi evidence for Scott was so strong that if Sheriff Laux truly believed that Scott committed the crime, then he truly has to be one of the dumbest law enforcement officers I've ever seen. I think that after 2 months of going absolutely nowhere with the investigation, Laux just became very desperate to solve the case and developed serious tunnel vision. And like many other cases in which innocent people are railroaded, Scott's arrest came about after he was interrogated for 12 hours and coerced into making a false confession. Even though Scott was informed of his constitutional rights and told that he could have an attorney present, this was still nearly 1 year away from the landmark Supreme Court decision Miranda versus Arizona. So I don't think that Scott, or most of the general public for that matter, would have been aware of what his rights truly were, and known that unless he was charged with something, he could have just walked out of that interrogation session at any time. I mean, halfway through the session, Scott was allowed to see his mother, who flat out told him not to confess to anything he didn't do, but he decided to confess anyway and tell the investigators what they wanted to hear, just to make the whole ordeal come to an end. And that's pretty much why the majority of false confessions take place, though Scott wound up being luckier than most in this situation, since his murder charges wound up being dropped before he went to trial. Other than his own confession, one of the only other pieces of so-called evidence against Scott were him failing some polygraph tests, which of course are unreliable and inadmissible as evidence, though I'm not sure if this was common knowledge back in 1965. There was also the presence of blood on Scott's pants, and even though he insisted it came from cleaning fish, the Indiana State Police Laboratory seemed to believe that it was human blood with the same properties as Edward's blood type. Of course, forensics have advanced so much that if this crime took place today, I'm sure they would be able to determine with absolute certainty if the blood was human or if it contained traces of Edward's DNA. I think the biggest issue is that after Scott was initially released from custody, Sheriff Laux covertly took these pants from the Banish residence while they were out of town, and it does not sound like he got a warrant to do this. So even if the blood was connected to the murders, the pants should have been inadmissible as evidence. Loretta Banish even said that she washed these pants after Scott returned home, and before they were given to the state police lab, so I don't know how reliable any testing on them would have been. And of course, Scott was flat out asked about the blood on his pants the first time he was questioned, so if the blood did belong to his father, it's odd that Scott never tried to get rid of the pants after he was released from custody. During the early stages of the investigation, the murder weapon could not be found, but Scott confessed that after he stabbed Edward and fled the scene, he hid the knife in a nearby wooded area, and after he returned home, he retrieved the knife and hid it inside a footlocker in his residence. Following Scott's arrest, this knife barely got mentioned at all, so even if police did find one in this footlocker, I'm guessing that it could not be proven that the knife was the murder weapon. If Scott was guilty, it really would make zero sense for him to retrieve an incriminating piece of evidence and keep it inside his own home for over a month, rather than completely getting rid of it. As unusual as Scott's alibi may have been, everything about it seemed to check out, as no less than 4 witnesses verified that he was on a fishing boat in the Pacific Ocean nearly 2,500 miles away from South Bend on the night his father was murdered, and Scott also produced a pay stub which was signed by the boat's captain, Paul Vines. It sounds like Sheriff Laux became suspicious because a couple of eyewitnesses reported having seen Scott in the South Bend area around the time of the murder, but eyewitnesses can be mistaken all the time. Even though Scott was using a false name, Daniel McFarland, Captain Vines spent 5 days alone on a boat with him, so I think he would be far less likely to be mistaken, and it's extremely unlikely that Vines, his wife, and the captain and deckhand from the second fishing boat, the Holmes, would lie under oath to protect Scott and help him get away with murder. Now, Sheriff Laux had his own theory to debunk Scott's alibi, but quite frankly, when I first read it, I almost felt like I could feel myself losing some IQ points. To recap, Laux believed that Captain Vines and the other witnesses were sincere when they said that Scott was on the boat, but they were actually interacting with a completely different young man named Daniel McFarland, who just happened to have a close resemblance to Scott. The story goes that after Scott traveled back to South Bend and killed his father, he then hopped on a flight back to Oregon and just happened to cross paths with the real Daniel McFarland. Scott then acquired Daniel's identification, as well as the pay stub from Captain Vines, in order to fabricate an alibi for himself. Of course, Laux never provided an explanation for why Daniel would hand these items over to Scott to begin with, and was never able to prove that another person named Daniel McFarland actually existed. This is why Laux' theory is one of the worst examples I've ever seen of an investigator twisting the facts to fit their narrative rather than following the facts to reach the most logical conclusion. The whole scenario of Scott stealing Daniel McFarland's identity seems way too elaborate for an 18-year-old high school kid, and the issue is, why would he go to the trouble of fabricating an alibi when he didn't even need one in the first place? Remember, at that point, law enforcement still believed that Scott had drowned. If Scott wanted to get away with the crime, he could have just gone on living his life on the other side of the country and stayed under the radar, and no one would have ever suspected he was the killer. Another egregious aspect of Laux' theory is that it almost seems to contradict itself. He believed that Scott returned home to South Bend in order to retrieve his birth certificate from a safety deposit box, but then accidentally stabbed his father when Edward walked in on him. But after traveling to Oregon and acquiring Daniel McFarland's identification in order to impersonate him, Scott then travels back to Indiana and attempts to enlist in the army under his real name? Surely Scott should have known that this would cause everyone to find out he was still alive and lead to him getting caught. The only reason Scott needed his birth certificate to begin with is because he was told he could not enlist without one, yet even though he failed to retrieve it, he still tries to enlist anyway? Wouldn't it make more sense to try and acquire a fake birth certificate under the name Daniel McFarland? Another odd aspect of the crime is that footprints were found in the dirt outside one of the basement windows, which suggests that the killer looked in there and would have seen Edward, Loretta, and Kathy playing cards with George and Albina Tangle that night. If Scott saw them, why would he run the risk of breaking into the house to steal his birth certificate when so many people were there and still awake? He doesn't have to worry about his father walking in on him if he elected to break in when no one was home. And of course, Loretta testified that her children's birth certificates were kept inside a safety deposit box at the bank rather than inside the house, though it's unclear if Scott would have known this. Even so, that doesn't change the fact that Scott's alibi is rock solid, so the only other option which involves him being complicit in the crime is if it was a murder for hire. But we're talking about an 18-year-old kid with very little money and resources in the pre-internet world of 1965, so there's no way he could have pulled something like that off. So yeah, Sheriff Laux and the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department completely dropped the ball when they railroaded Scott, and may have let other potential leads slip through their fingers. While I'm glad that Scott went on to live what appeared to be a good life for the next 5 decades, it is disappointing that he technically never got his name cleared or saw justice for his murdered father. Remember, even though the grand jury felt there was insufficient evidence to indict Scott, he was not exonerated per se, and his attempt to file a lawsuit against the Sheriff's Department for his unlawful treatment was dismissed. But unfortunately, if you take Scott out of the equation, I really have no idea who could have committed this crime or what the motive might have been. The initial theory seemed to be that the crime was a burglary gone wrong and Edward was killed because he interrupted an intruder. It's possible this intruder wasn't planning to commit murder and tried to flee the scene, but given that he was a career military man, Edward may have made an attempt to catch him before he escaped, but the perpetrator responded by stabbing him several times. However, I do have to harken back to those footprints in the dirt outside the basement window, which indicates that the killer likely knew that at least 5 people were inside the house that night. Granted, they may have thought it was a good opportunity to break in and steal something while everybody was downstairs, but it's still very risky to do that when you know that any of them could come upstairs and catch you in the act at any time. Alternatively, if this was a premeditated murder and Edward was intentionally targeted, perhaps the perpetrator did not look through the basement window until after Edward went upstairs, so they knew he would be alone inside his bedroom. If Edward woke up and put up a fight, that would explain why he was stabbed in the living room instead. But again, why would Edward be targeted? Did he have any enemies with a motive to kill him? Since nothing appeared to have been stolen, and Edward's wallet and the killer's flashlight were left behind at the scene, this does strike me as a pretty amateurish crime committed by someone who didn't know what they were doing. I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but let's not forget that the army had originally been planning to transfer Edward to Thailand in July, but canceled these orders after his son went missing. It's unclear if the whole family was going to be transferred, or if Edward was going to go to Thailand alone, while his wife and children remained in South Bend, as he was only planning to remain in the military for 1 more year before he retired. But if Scott had not disappeared, then there's a good chance that Edward would have been on the other side of the world on August the 22nd, and he never would have been murdered. So this does make me ponder the possibility that the perpetrator believed that someone else was going to be living in the Banish residence on that particular night, and some sort of mistaken identity took place. Now, during the time period between when Scott was released from custody in early September and was charged with murder in late October, the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department did investigate a couple of other potential leads, most of which never panned out. In the weeks following Edward's murder, the Banishes had 2 separate anonymous notes mailed to the residence by someone threatening to kill the rest of the family. But it turned out that the writer was a 19-year-old divorced woman from the area, and while her motive for doing this is unclear, investigators concluded that the notes were nothing more than a cruel prank, and the woman had no involvement in the murder. Looking through the newspaper archives, perhaps the most promising lead was a confession from a 23-year-old suspect named Larry Thomas, who was arrested for an unrelated crime in Indianapolis on August the 30th, which, coincidentally enough, was the exact same day that Scott was discovered to be alive. Thomas was charged with rape and armed robbery after robbing a dentist's office at gunpoint and sexually assaulting the receptionist, but while he was incarcerated in the Marion County Jail, he allegedly bragged about having recently stabbed a man to death in South Bend. When Sheriff Locks traveled to Indianapolis to interview Thomas, he recanted his confession. Thomas maintained that he had never even been to South Bend and only read about Edward Banish's murder in the newspapers, as it sounds like he didn't reveal any details about the crime which were not already public knowledge. Thomas worked as a waiter at an Indianapolis motel, and work records did apparently confirm that he worked until 6 p.m. on August the 22nd, but since it takes about 2.5 hours to drive to South Bend from Indianapolis, I suppose it's not impossible that Thomas could have made it to the Banish residence to commit the crime shortly before midnight. Locks openly expressed his skepticism that Thomas was the perpetrator, but at the same time, none of the contemporary news accounts state that Thomas was officially ruled out as a suspect either. Given how badly he botched his investigation into Scott, I'm hoping that Locks didn't overlook something which could have linked Thomas to the murder, and he let him slip through his fingers. But if it was conclusively proven that Thomas couldn't have done it, I can see how Locks might have become overwhelmed with frustration at all these leads which turned out to be dead ends. This could explain why he started focusing on Scott as the prime suspect again, even though there was concrete evidence supporting his innocence. So yeah, I honestly have no idea who killed Edward, but all I do know for certain is that it wasn't Scott. If this was in fact a burglary gone wrong, and Edward was murdered by a complete stranger with no personal connection to him, then this individual got incredibly lucky that their victim had a missing son who would just happen to be found alive 1 week later. Were it not for all these wild twists and turns involving Scott, then the investigation might have turned out differently, but this killer's crime wound up being overshadowed by the most sensational story to hit South Bend that year. I know that nearly 60 years have passed, and it's reasonable to assume that the killer is now deceased, but if by chance you happen to have any information about the murder of Edward Banish, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Holly Dodson for narrating the opening of this episode. We've been carrying on this monthly listener voiceover contest for over 7 years now, and if you've already entered, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. And once again, we're going to be releasing another Q&A episode next month, so if you have a question you would like me to answer on the show, please send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Q&A, to robin.warder@icloud.com. The deadline to send in questions will be just over 2 weeks from now on Friday, December the 13th. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available on our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a Halloween-themed bonus episode about reincarnation, which covers the controversial Unsolved Mysteries segment about George Rudolph and her belief that she was the reincarnation of a young woman who died at the turn of the 20th century. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a bizarre case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1984 disappearance and subsequent death of Tim Molnar. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 70 of these commentary tracks in archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Donald J., Margaret F., and Jacqueline H.K. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.